This is a Reconstructionist Radio audiobook recording. Please visit AmericanVision.org to purchase this book. The Problem of Slavery in Christian America, an Ethical Judicial History of American Slavery and Racism, by Dr. Joel McDermott, narrated by Joe Salant. American Vision Press, Powder Springs, Georgia. Copyright 2017. Published by American Vision, AmericanVision.org. To Brent Allen Winters, TheCommonLawyer.com. Opposed to honor is shame, the fear on our part of doing that which shall justly expose us to disgrace. Reverend James Henley Thornwell. Preface. A few years ago, I assisted in a private interview of a very interesting fellow, Lyon Tyler Jr., the living grandson of John Tyler, 10th President of the United States. Hard as it may be to believe, Lyon's grandpa, President Tyler, was born in 1790 during George Washington's presidency. Tyler's son, Lyon Sr., was born late in life, in 1853. In turn, Lyon Sr. fathered Lyon Jr. late in life in 1924, making just 3 generations span the unusually long period of 227 years, now and counting. With this panoramic perspective in mind, the interviewer, a highly educated historian and economist, began to discuss the amazing technological change that had occurred in that time span. After mentioning the advance from quill and ink communication to telegraphy to smartphones, horse-drawn carts to automobiles and airplanes, the vast expansion of electricity, etc., he asked Mr. Tyler, "What are some of the things in your life that you lived through that we can now look back and say, that was a huge amount of change? That would certainly not have been believable to your grandfather, but probably not even believable to your father." On a completely different wavelength, the old man, without hesitation, answered, "I think the most important thing was the change in the way we treated black people." Mr. Tyler had grown up in Charles City County, Virginia, which he said was almost 80% black during the era of segregation. In the early 1960s, he had moved to Montgomery, Alabama, where he and his wife took part in some of the civil rights work of that era. He had lived his life right through the middle of some of the most crucial changes in race relations and had a front row seat the whole way. On the way home from that interview, the interviewer and I marveled at that answer. Considering the grand sweep of social change that took place throughout this man's life, the single most outstanding change, which would have been unbelievable to Lyon Sr.'s and certainly President Tyler's generations, the antebellum era, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow, was the social and judicial equality of black people. I was born in 1974, a decade after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Yet I suppose nearly everyone from even my own generation can recall overhearing, perhaps participating in, overtly racist discussions. Many can tell stories even today, even if only of the variety, quote, "I can't believe that in this day and age someone would still talk like that," end quote. I can recall numerous experiences of such racism, even in just my own brief life, from childhood until even today. Among my earliest memories was a racist comment from myself, and for no good reason at all. I was probably 4 years old and was infuriated with trucks because my father briefly owned a coal trucking business. Anytime I would see a truck, I would make the hand pump signal to prompt the driver to blow his horn. One day, a tri-axle dump truck rolled past us at a gas station. I immediately raised my arm through the window and then, just as quickly, drew it back. I remember the words coming out of my 4-year-old mouth. Quote, "I don't want to wave at him. He's black." End quote. My mother immediately reprimanded me. It was from her I heard the words long before I even knew about Martin Luther King Jr. We do not judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I don't know what prompted or influenced me to say what I did at that age. I had no reason to. I had never even met a black person that I remember. The southern Indiana county in which we had lived at the time was about 97% white and only 0.5% black. I had no negative experiences, and I had not seen anything on Sesame Street or the Muppets that would have influenced me in such a way. Maybe it was Bugs Bunny, though, now that I think of it. My parents divorced when I was almost 5, and both remarried soon after. I left Indiana with my mother and a stepfather and ended up eventually in Fort Smith, Arkansas. There, I started 2nd grade and would eventually stay until I got married at age 27. The demographic in Fort Smith overall was different. Only 69% white and 9% black. You would never know this, however, from experiencing the side of town on which I grew up. It was not much different from my early childhood. My elementary school had probably somewhere around 400 or 500 students, and I can recall only one black. The same was true in middle school, with only 2 or 3 blacks out of 700 or 800. I can remember that even in grade school, even though we were friendly to the one black student in person, we also did not hesitate to tell what we called, quote, nigger jokes, end quote, in private. We knew it was wrong, but we told and laughed anyway. On one occasion, during a history class on the subject, a particularly crude and perhaps slow student referred jokingly to the black student as a Negro slave. The teacher, already overly proper as it was, stiffened immediately and then sent that student to the principal's office. Granted, this was an extraordinary case, but the fact that even the last guy in the class to know when to keep his mouth shut was still saying that kind of thing right in front of everyone speaks to the state of the culture at the time in its own way. Who knows what that kid heard at home? That was in mid-America in 1985. High school was even more interesting. In Fort Smith, there were 2, North Side and South Side. Almost all the blacks lived on the north side of town, and thus their children went to North Side. South Side, my first year, had probably about 1,200 students and only about 4 or 5 blacks in the whole school. The division between the 2 schools had been made in 1963, in the wake of school desegregation, when the single high school in town was divided into 2. North Side, originally just Fort Smith High School, was the first, and South Side was the new split, and it would be 99% white. It could not have been scripted to be more symbolic, except it was not symbolic at all. It was as real as can be. To make matters even worse, our South Side school mascot was Johnny Reb, a stylized Confederate soldier, wielding the flag and the whole bit, and the fight song was Dixie. I can still remember pep rallies in which the greatest cheer came when the school principal played it on his harmonica. This occurred as late as 1993. Common sense did finally begin to chip away at this astonishingly long-lived insult. In my sophomore year, protests had led to the Confederate flag being banned from all official school use. We still had Johnny Reb, and the students themselves could still freely wave the flag, but the school was forbidden to do so. Later, in 2000, they finally prohibited students from displaying it as well. Finally, in the past couple of years, the school finally got rid of Dixie and the mascot altogether. Yet not even this final step transpired without a small rebellion of its own. A local lawyer led opposition to the removal of the rebel and allegedly hired an airplane to fly a banner over the school's graduation ceremony. Rebels forever, remember, in September. September was the next school board election. This resulted in an emotional board meeting with gasps and tears shed as one public official resigned and others rebuked selfish publicity stunts. Perhaps most shocking of all, however, was the reaction when a local news anchor posted the news on his Facebook page. Comments came back mostly hostile to the board's 7-0 vote to change the Confederate rebel mascot. Sad day. They are complete morons. My doctor's last name is Rebel. They're going to make her change her name. This is awful. I graduated from Southside in 1998 and thought it was a great school. Now our school system is losing their damn minds. Ridiculous. PC sheeple everywhere. What's next? Political correctness erases decades of history. So what's the new name? Transgenderites? Question mark, question mark, question mark. A bathroom with no name? ... That's ridiculous. Sad deal if you ask me, not right at all. To the people who thinks the rebel flag is all about hatred and racism, reread history. It's about the Civil War and our heritage. The first slave owner was an African American, not whites. I'm sick of my heritage being run into the ground over lies and assumptions. All you're doing is causing a race war. Shit needs to stop now. I sure did not want to see this happen. When is Cracker Barrel going to change its name? I take offense to it. Or MLK Boulevard in Fayetteville, or any of the schools that have a Black Panther mascot. See how ridiculous this could continue? Geez, people, it's a tradition. Good grief. When will the madness stop? When do we say enough is enough? They are taking all of our rights away. The right to fly any flag we wish. Play any song at school. Oh, wait until you can't play Dixie. It's offensive. Good Lord. Don't you see just how ridiculous people are? Let everyone who dislikes political correctness spend whatever it takes to get the superintendent fired and the school board members recalled/defeated in election. Let's get rid of the NAACP, black alumni, black etc., because it's racist and it offends me. These are the Facebook comments. There does not seem to be a lot of reflection on historical facts. Sensitivity to offensive symbols, genuine racial offense or much else, but instead a general sense of being attacked by liberals. There was an immediate expression of a polarized society in which the racial issue meets with a defensiveness of tradition, alleged hypocrisy, and the encroach of political correctness. Have we come a long way? It's easy for many people, especially those who are largely insulated from racial tensions within mostly white suburban or rural confines, to think we have come a long way. Indeed we have. But we also must recognize that, in many ways, we have not come very far. Not only could we probably all point to some kind of racist misbehavior even today, or at least within our lifetimes, it was even within my parents' generation that some people were still being lynched. During most lynchings in American history, scores, if not hundreds, of white townsfolk stood by nodding in self-righteous approval, in some cases outright celebration, that the extra-legal violence and torture had rid the streets of one more black person who was allegedly a criminal, a rapist, or fill in the blank. When mob violence acts outside of due process, it does not matter what you put in the blank. These scores and hundreds would have been many of my generation's grandparents. Granted, we are a long way from the lynching heyday at the turn of the last century, but we are not so far from its effects, nor from the chains and even bloodstains of racism and hatred that have trickled down the stream of history, nor of various legacies of it from which blacks still objectively suffer in some ways today. Likewise, we must also acknowledge that for however far we have come begrudgingly, as if someone had to drag us along the way. Our begrudging spirit affects not only how we arrived, but how we view the whole path along the way. For some, this effect is more extreme than for others. But whites and white leadership too often remain oblivious to the objective facts of history, wait far too long to address them, or frequently even deny them. Far too often, these leaders have been the very people we trust to lead us in doing what's moral and right. As you will see in part 2 of this book, the clergy and church leadership in the South provided much of the most vocal support for racism and slavery during the slave days and far beyond. As late as the 1960s, we can read of blacks being turned away from Methodist churches. These were not local businesses, public facilities, schools, or political functions. These were the houses of prayer, love, healing, fellowship, brotherhood, and the Word of God. I have heard anecdotes from people who witnessed blacks withstood at the doors of Southern Presbyterian churches as late as the mid-1970s. The Southern Baptist Convention officially apologized only as recently as 1995 for its role in racial injustices. The Methodist Church took until 2000. The Episcopal Church, surprisingly, 2006. The Presbyterian Church in America, PCA, last year, 2016, confessed sins in this area, and not without opposition from within the church. What kind of moral leadership does any church expect to display in society when they are so badly, so far behind the society itself in moral understanding and willingness to confess its sins? How can we call a nation and its individuals to repentance if we cannot demonstrate repentance ourselves? We are not even free from overt racism among us today. I recall one recent incident in a casual discussion with two men I know well. One of them, a police officer, responded to the mention of the name Martin Luther King Jr. on a nearby television with, quote, "You mean Martin Luther Coon? Question mark?" End quote. Expecting a laugh from the other party. Of course, such a quip would never occur in public, and certainly not in the presence of blacks. But in private, even some of our finest still consider it acceptably humorous to denigrate blacks, and a highly symbolic one at that, which implies a dismissal of the black cause as well. That was an extremely mild case. America, North, South, East, and West, still contains strident racists, many neo-Confederate activists, and many who see their white supremacy as traditional conservatism, and either a direct development of or strongly interwoven with their Christian faith. Aside from the remnants of the KKK, there are Southern Presbyterians and Southern Baptists and others who maintain various degrees of developed theologies of white supremacy, white exclusivity, ethno-nationalism, segregationism, and more. Among such groups, you can witness not only overt praise of segregation and white nationalist propaganda, but even defenses of German National Socialist Party, or Nazis, coupled with laments of the Nuremberg trials, and much more. One such blog carries an anecdote from a segregationist who once worked as a corrections officer. Because he witnessed one Latino inmate whistle at a white female officer, he purposefully singled out the offender for a well-publicized strip search. He described handcuffing the guy and purposefully drawing out the search as long as possible for the sole purpose of humiliation. This behavior, terrible as it is, can actually pass under the color of law because prisons can have tight regulations against sexual harassment, and inmates do not have many rights against impromptu searches. These are issues of criminal justice reform to be addressed separately, but they are certainly connected both historically and socially with racism and slavery in America, but it does demonstrate the lengths to which some overt racists will go to assert force and humiliation against minorities. This was not about justice or doing one's job. It was stated specifically by the author to be about white revenge and the humiliation of someone he perceived to be of inferior racial status. It also shows how even open racists can work within current social conventions, access power positions, including law enforcement, and under the color of law impose racial discrimination and get away with it. Likewise, it is not difficult to find churches where white supremacist and segregationist doctrines constitute the norm for not only the ministry, but the majority of the congregation. I could tell of at least one modern Presbyterian minister in North Carolina whose church was almost completely taken over by white supremacist activists. These people exist, and they are dead serious in their beliefs that there can be no conservative tradition without segregation, and any suggestion of race mixing is some form of Marxism. Yet it is important to realize that such people are not necessarily mean, radical skinheads tattooing themselves with swastikas and fantasizing about mowing down their racial enemies with machine guns. These are otherwise calm, church-going, professing Christians who see themselves as the rightful heirs of the conservative tradition and Christian civilization, and can often articulate a case for it well enough to overwhelm the average person, and in some cases, even educated folk. Why this book? This book, however, is not aimed at refuting the modern fringe extremists, except incidentally when we review the Southern theologians and apologists' claims, but rather reaching the millions of Christians and conservatives who do not realize that what we consider extremists today were by far the mainstream majority only a couple generations ago, let alone in the antebellum era, and what ramifications that has for learning, history, and contemporary social and political relations. Today's Christians and conservatives are largely unaware of the extent of the suffering of blacks, from slavery to Jim Crow in the 1960s and even to today. They are largely unaware how systematic it was and what institutions were created specifically to maintain the injustices. Christians are largely unaware that their own clergy and churches were among the leading proponents of the systems, and have no idea of the convicting and sad reasons why, or of the theological justifications for turning a blind eye to the injustice, or worse, active perpetuation. That such theologies are still widely sought today, and are in some cases the norm, is not a good sign when so many social ills still surround a silent church. In general, Christians and conservatives are not nearly as informed as they think when it comes to understanding black history in the United States and the black saga it contains. When confronted, therefore, with the justly emotional expressions of blacks who beg us to recognize the uniqueness of their history, which really is all of our history, white conservatives and Christians, almost by virtue of the circumstances, can only react from a position of ignorance and or current partisan politics. We automatically react only to the surface political dimensions of the modern problem. Quote, "These leftists are crazy. Political correctness, playing the race card," end quote. The refusal even to entertain the discussion can leave blacks feeling as if whites have no desire to understand them, but only desire to shut down the only avenues of resolution that appear open to blacks. This book is aimed at providing otherwise well-intentioned Christians and conservatives a deeper understanding of the history, a starting point for discussion, or if necessary, repentance, and with a biblical response to the larger problem while refusing to capitulate to non-Christian leftism. How white reactions to the black population in America evolved through stages to create or help create the unique circumstances of black history has been a factor in the problem of teaching that history. There is a logical continuum from the racism developed by whites to institute slavery, then segregation, and then the post-civil rights era. This racism may not remain on everyone's lips. But not only is it unbelievably still on some, it still inheres in certain laws, settlements, and institutions. Since we are in the post-civil rights era, and we are past things like lynching, overt legal segregation, and the social acceptability of the word nigger, we think implicitly that we are also past racism. Couple this with the fact that leftists do often, quote, play the race card, end quote, and otherwise abuse the issue, and conservatives are likely to dismiss nearly any talk of racism and suffering of blacks as soon as it comes up. It is rarely accompanied by anything overt that has historically been understood under that label, and so conservatives do not see such shades and influences of racism as racism. No one is demanding blacks walk to the back of the bus anymore, after all. We're past that. But to reappropriate something, the great economist Frederick Bastiat once said, "The error is in what is not seen." In terms of perceptions and understanding of racial history by whites, there is much that is not seen still today. But in not seeing it, we too often react dismissively or negatively against the subject altogether. In short, racist activity and political reaction have evolved a situation where it is no longer racism on the sleeve. Racism can, however, still be incidental, subconscious, unconscious, or in other lamentable cases, it can be covert, hidden, and protected by circumstances, legal procedures, or legal immunities. This does not mean, by any means, that everything someone says is racism is in fact racism. But it does mean we ought to give a close reading to a lot of facts of history that most Christians and conservatives generally do not hear about in proper detail, but which blacks often do hear about from people who often have an agenda. This creates an awkward relationship in which blacks want us merely to acknowledge the facts, but we stymie any discussion at all because we only see an agenda and wish to head it off. This is a highly unfortunate situation, especially in such a strongly polarized political climate. But it could be remedied if Christians and conservatives got in front of the situation with the heart, mind, and example of Christ. Then we could begin to heal the real problem while simultaneously delegitimizing those with a leftist political agenda as well. Addressing racism and slavery in America. As with the vast majority of historical subjects, standard education about racism, slavery, segregation, and much of black history in America is greatly limited. From the standard account, average Americans probably have retained about this much of the basic story. American whites instituted slavery. They enslaved blacks and their children permanently for life. Slaves were treated badly. Northern states eventually abolished slavery, but southern states did not. Disagreements over slavery led the South to try to secede from the Union. The Civil War was fought over this secession over slavery. In the end, the North won, and probably the one fact all remember, if they only retain one fact, Lincoln freed the slaves. The standard account continues. But Southerners continued rebelling in a different way. They passed segregation laws, making blacks to sit in the back of the bus and to drink from separate water fountains. In some cases, blacks were lynched, hung, burned to death. This stuff was slowly ended during the 50s and 60s. Brown versus Board of Education desegregated the schools. Then the Civil Rights Movement eventually ended segregation altogether. While it has been slow coming, with each new generation of students being taught that racism and discrimination are wrong, we have almost eliminated racism. While the majority of these basic facts are all true and vital, they honestly make up only a marginal part of the relevant reality. Yes, the vast majority of us now admit that American chattel slavery, ownership of another person as personal property, and Jim Crow segregation was wrong, right? So why can't we just move on? We cannot just move on because what is left is so important to developing the consciousness we need today, as well as the awakening needed to develop that consciousness. The mainstream is always the safe stream. Stick with the basic, accepted establishment account and everyone remains calm. But also, nothing changes. The kinds of moral and institutional issues that demand addressing in any given era will require you to explore waters outside of that safe stream. Few citizens liked the abolitionists in their day. Even fewer would openly associate with them. Yes, even in the North. Yet in hindsight, virtually no one today would confess the abolitionists were wrong about American slavery, even if we disagree with the unorthodox theological beliefs and associations of many of them. The emulation of that example on virtually any issue in any given era will require us to explore facts, ask questions, and entertain uncomfortable perspectives and answers, and then often undertake the gruesome surgeries of history and humanity that require reopening wounds, examining, cleaning, cauterizing, sewing, and lots of pharmaceuticals and therapy afterwards. This process can only begin with education. So the following chapters begin by giving you a closer look at the processes of both racism and slavery, two separate issues that became inseparably related very early in American history, the forces behind them, the forces that normalize them, the fights to overcome them, the role of the churches, the role of the special applications of theology made by these churches, the creation of myths and ideologies to serve tragic ends, the social reactions of historical denial, the perpetuation of racism after the Civil War, the legacies we still have today because of it, the pervasive nature of this racism in both North and South, and the consequences of it, and more. It is my goal to provide Christians and conservatives with a view of how bad it really was and why, in an effort to stimulate the level of empathy for the black cause that will lead to getting something righteous done about it. It is not enough, however, to just get something done. We need to understand the problems in such a way as to be able to suggest what must be done and why, as well as what must not be done from a biblical Christian perspective. This part of the program will involve as much awareness, consciousness, and Bible and soul searching on the part of black Christians as whites. But the first part of that particular problem is to get the whites to the table, informed, aware, willing to listen, ready to participate. If I can facilitate only that much with this book, I will consider it a laudable progress, but nevertheless, not a full victory. In the end, I desire to see social change regarding race and criminal justice so full and so radical that were he here to continue his grand long life, Mr. Lyon Tyler Jr. himself would not believe it. What to expect? The best way I can think to spark the needed awakening is to start with what startled and aroused me to action on this topic: the history of slavery and slave laws and the role of the churches in perpetuating them. Then, I read just how openly and unconscionable and callous the justifications and defenses of racism and slavery were, not just from the planters and politicians, but especially from the men who should have known far better, the pastors. It is for this reason that I structured a whole chapter of this book as I have. Responses to the claims, arguments, lies, myths, and propaganda produced by Southern theologians. In my case, I will focus on the defense of Virginia and through her of the South by Robert Louis Dabney. But rest assured that Dabney's position is without question representative of the hundreds of other pro-slavery defenses that appeared beginning in the 1800s. If anything, Dabney is in some cases milder than others. I must cover a few housekeeping items. For one, the term racism is always problematic. Folks on the left toss it around too frequently. But just as often, conservatives recoil at any use of the word to condemn anything more than clear, overt expressions of white supremacy. In this book, when I use racism, racist, or other derivative terms, I mean what the conservative black economist Thomas Sowell called the legitimate use of it. Quote, a term of moral denunciation of racially discriminatory behavior, end quote. If a man who is perhaps the most prominent black conservative intellectual in America can accept as legitimate the broader sense of the term, which includes general discrimination, I find it acceptable as well for this work. Further, this book is entitled The Problem of Slavery in Christian America, an ethical judicial critique of American slavery and racism. This contains several points of its own worth mentioning. First, the main title, The Problem of Slavery in Christian America, plays off the work of a giant in the field, David Bryan Davis. His hefty volumes, The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, 1966, and The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution, 1999, as well as The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Emancipation, 2014, are substantial in every way and are probably the closest thing to being definitive works in a field that defies definitive works. While not pretending to have achieved the same status as Davis's works, which beyond these are voluminous, by any means, I have adopted the theme because I wanted to provide the same type of work with the same type of academic tone for the evangelical Christian world. And I thought it was particularly fitting for the nature of much of the writing which follows. Second, ethical judicial refers to our moral foundations and laws and means that this book will emphasize the role of laws and institution pertaining to race and slavery. This includes the roles of both the state and the church, as well as other key social customs and economic factors, all of which are moral issues. For this reason, Part 1 of the book details what may be called the, quote, secular history of these issues. Then Part 2 backs up and tells the history of the churches and religious doctrines involved. And unfortunately, there is much to tell. The description also, however, designates the need for objective standards by which we critique the facts of our history and our attitudes to each other, especially when these are not petty. The prophets, of which I am not, would have called this type of historical exercise a covenant lawsuit, judging one's history and institutions according to the law of God, to love our neighbors as ourselves. Third, I do not pretend to address the whole history of slavery, nor slavery or slavery in itself as an abstraction, an equivocation by which quite a few defenders of the institution stymied many a critic in debate, but specifically American slavery. By this I mean the institution as it came to be practiced specifically in North America, later the United States and the Confederate States of America. In its historical setting, slavery in America meant a very specific set of laws, practices, realities, abuses, reactions, prejudices, etc., all of which are inseparable from each other. Anyone defending slavery in that context was defending the whole of it, no matter what caveat they provided, and anyone criticizing slavery in that context was criticizing the whole, no matter what debate opponent or respondent was able to divert the discussion into an abstraction. Here we specify American slavery to cover the whole system in its various forms from the arrival of the first Africans in Virginia around 1619, all the way to industrial penal slavery as late as the 1940s, and perhaps in some select instances beyond. Fourth, the book deals with both slavery and racism. In the American context, slavery and racism were made almost inseparable very early in the process, and Part 1 explains how and why that occurred. But it did not always remain this way. The slavery that existed primarily against blacks remained strong long after slavery was formally ended. Society, state, and church all partook of this sin for decades after the institution of slavery was officially abolished. Even where some form or legacies of the slave system did not exist, racism still pervaded nearly every area of life. While this book does not purport to be anywhere near an exhaustive history of either slavery or racism, not even just in America, it is certainly more than enough, I believe, to answer the need for knowledge on the subject, to call where necessary some members of society and churches to repentance for neglecting, denying, or dismissing the painful realities. On a stylistic note, while this is a heavily documented and footnoted work, I have tried to create a convention that would make it as readable as possible without resorting to the moral evil of endnotes. Had I stuck with the traditional academic footnotes at each citation or reference, this book would have been so filled with footnotes that only academic readers might have found it tolerable. A more relaxed publishing convention today leaves all the references in any given paragraph for one cumulative footnote at that paragraph's end. I have relaxed even that standard generally throughout the work. I have saved cumulative footnotes for 2 or 3 paragraphs, and in some cases even more. Readers who care enough about the sources to check the research should have the wherewithal to discover the relevant footnote only a few lines down in the work. Readers not inclined to such research themselves will, I assume, not be bothered by that, and will probably be thankful the text is a bit freer of academic apparatus. If you are reading and get the feeling I have left important claims or quotations unreferenced, be patient. I have neither ignored them nor plagiarized them, At least not intentionally. The footnotes are probably just a little bit below or around the corner. Anything found undocumented, however, I will gratefully acknowledge and hope to amend in any future printings. With that said, let us turn our attention to the first European settlement in America, to a time and place where there were yet neither footnotes nor black slaves, but soon to be a whole lot of both, with almost 400 painful years lying ahead.